Documentary on how the Lakota Sioux created an empire on the northern Great Plains, attained a nearly mythological status in American history, inflicted a string of stunning victories on the U.S. Army, and how they were eventually defeated. Part 1. The Sioux tribe originally came from the area around Lake Superior, and the Lakota were only one of 7 sub-tribes. This is why you often see them called Lakota Sioux, to distinguish them from other Sioux like the Dakotas or Yanktons. The Sioux world of the 1600s was oriented towards the French Great Lakes fur trade. French voyagers visited modern-day Wisconsin and Minnesota, looking for beaver furs where the Sioux were widely known to have the most and best. The Sioux world of the 1600s was oriented towards the French Great Lakes fur trade. French voyagers visited modern-day Wisconsin and Minnesota looking for beaver furs where the Sioux were widely known to have the most and best. From first contact with French traders, the Sioux were already one of the most numerous in the Great Lakes region. This is likely for 2 reasons. 1. The ecology of the Sioux lands in Wisconsin and Minnesota was a calorie-rich paradise, with plenty of game, fish, berries, and wild rice. 2. The Sioux have always showed a remarkable flexibility in assimilating others relative to other Indian tribes, so long as they adopted Sioux thought, values, language, and custom. This gave them an edge in replenishing numbers with war captives, refugees, and allies. Because of their size, the Sioux fell victim to the classic geopolitical conundrum of being so large that coalitions formed to oppose their expansion, but not so large that the Sioux could overcome all of them. Well-armed Cree and Assiniboine began pushing into Sioux lands. The Lakota were the westernmost of the Sioux sub-tribes and lived in the transitional space between the eastern woodlands and the Great Plains. As they felt the pressure of incoming groups, they began to migrate out of Mississippi River Basin into the Missouri Valley. The rivers and creeks of the Great Plains are its arteries and capillaries, and nearly all movement was along these waterways. They provided transportation, food, shelter, timber, fuel, water. The grasslands between were mostly avoided, except for occasional hunting done on foot. The Missouri River and its tributaries were already inhabited by settled agricultural tribes, the Mandan, Arikara, and Hidatsa, and the Lakota began to displace them in the early 1700s. 2 key technologies arrived, which the Lakota got a hold of and mastered first. Because the Lakota were still connected to their Sioux cousins around the Great Lakes, they were able to import guns and ammunition. Soon, European traders began bringing the guns to them on the Missouri from Canada and up from New Orleans. They also learned about horses, originally stolen by Pueblos from the Spanish in New Mexico. By the 1700s, horse culture was making its way northwards across the plains. Horses naturally preferred the southern plains south of the Platte River, where it was warmer, and their numbers increased dramatically. Northern Plains Indians began sending parties southwards to steal, capture, or trade for horses. The better-armed Lakota were able to capitalize on this. Horses need more care in northern climes, so the Lakota never had as many as the Comanche in the south, but their herds grew. A people definitionally becomes nomadic when they can get every member on horseback. This switch occurred for the Lakota during 1720 to 1750. We know because of the Sioux tradition of keeping winter counts on buffalo robes, which we can still read and interpret. Becoming nomadic allowed the Lakota to begin hunting buffalo by horseback, penetrating and owning the space between the waterways. Protein-only diets are unsustainable, so the Lakota also got in the habit of raiding their settled neighbors for access to carbohydrates. The Lakota Empire developed on this basis, well-armed nomadic bands following the herds across the prairie, with vassal tribes providing labor for crops. Other plains, tribes like the Cheyenne and Arapaho, recognized the strength of the Lakota and eventually became allies. Gorging on unlimited bison calories, well-armed and astride horses, the Lakota exploded outwards. They captured the Black Hills in 1775 to 1776 from the Crow and Cheyenne, and immediately adopted it as their spiritual homeland. The Indian Vaccination Act of 1832 gave a boost to the Lakota Empire. By controlling the Missouri, the Lakota were vaccinated against smallpox by U.S. Indian agents and prevented upriver tribes from being inoculated. The smallpox epidemic of 1837 could kill off 90% of these tribes. The Lakota began a bitter 50-year war against the Crow in the Yellowstone River Valley, the longest war in American history. They also fought with Utes, Kiowa, Omaha, Blackfeet, and numerous others, and usually won. Interestingly, the Comanche, the dominant tribe of the Southern Plains, mostly left Lakota territory alone, directing their violence into Texas and Mexico. Both Lakota and Comanche generally respected their border along the Arkansas River, and skirmishes BTW, the two were rare. From an anthropological perspective, the Sioux seemed to possess an intelligence, sophistication, and adaptability absent in other tribes. They kept records, had an elaborate religion, understood the politics of the world around them, and crucially could adapt on the battlefield. They were universally described as tall and handsome, their aquiline features becoming the standard in American art of Native Americans. Whether all this was cultural or genetic is outside the scope of this thread, but you get the sense that the Lakota were in fact different. The Lakota were certainly violent. Mutilation and torture of enemies were the norm. Corpses were mutilated to prevent an enemy from enjoying the afterlife. Scalps were taken as trophies. Just like in other tribes, it was often the women who performed the torture. Yet the Lakota were not as gratuitously violent as, say, the Comanche. Violence served a purpose, but so did diplomacy. They could shift rapidly between hostility and reconciliation if the situation demanded it. The Lakota needed war for their young men, but it was controlled. This flexibility in all things, from incorporating others to shifting ways of life when necessary, to adapting to new geographies, to the pragmatism of diplomatic statecraft, is what made the Lakota the horse lords of the northern Great Plains. Next, we'll discuss their inevitable and intractable conflict with the United States, their military strategies and successes, including the famous Battle of the Little Bighorn with General Custer, and eventual subjugation to reservation life. Part 2 coming soon. Hit the subscribe button and share.